been seeing a lot of this kind of content lately. Only 2000s kids will understand. I've also seen a lot of nostalgic content for 90s kids, and I'm sure it won't be long before I start seeing only 2010s kids will understand. If you look at the comments, people seem to love this kind of content. Basically everything before COVID was nostalgic and hit different. Bro, I freaking missed the 2000s because we had so much fun ass kids in the 2000s. I know I'm not a 2000s kid, but wow, it still gives me nostalgia in some of those images. Everything changed. Now everyone just uses phones all the time. I wish I could go back in time, yet to the back old days. What? Now it's just me, suffering all day long because no one cares about me anymore. That got a lot sadder than I expected. It seems like nostalgia is running rampant lately, and maybe it always has been, but I specifically see a lot of millennials and older Gen Z now talking about how much worse things are than when they were kids 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And I do it too. I'm getting to the end of my 20s, and the older I get, the older I feel. Over the years, as I shuffle closer and closer to the grave, I find myself getting more and more nostalgic. I probably, hopefully, have a lot of life to live, but for the first time in my life, I feel like a significant portion of my life is behind me, and sometimes I find myself missing those times. But is this nostalgia healthy for me and everybody else who's experiencing it? Are we looking back on good times in a way that adds value to our life now, or are we kind of living in the past at the expense of the present, and maybe even at the expense of our mental health? Be sure to watch till the end because the answer might surprise you. Long ago, everybody who liked this video, and myself, would have been considered mentally ill. Starting in the 1600s, nostalgia was considered a neurological disorder that was grouped in with homesickness. It was observed in Swiss mercenaries that were displaying symptoms like excessive thoughts of home, bouts of weeping, and insomnia. Even as the narrative around nostalgia began to change over time, it was still regarded as a mental illness, specifically a type of melancholia or depression, until around the 1970s. That's when a sociologist named Fred Davis presented nostalgia as being distinct from homesickness and highlighted some of its good aspects, like positive associations with childhood memories and feelings of warmth when thinking about old times. This eventually led to a lot of the research that we have on nostalgia today, which basically presents it as a mixed bag, with distinct positives and negatives. But before we dive more into that, it's worth gaining a basic understanding of what's actually going on in our brains when we feel nostalgic. Nostalgia is a relatively complicated emotional experience, so as you might expect, there's several cognitive regions and processes involved in it. First off, there's so many things that can trigger nostalgia, and a lot of them are related to our senses. I'm not somebody who likes taking pictures mainly because they come out like this. But a lot of people do, and one of the reasons why, at least in part, is because they can be powerful nostalgia triggers that basically transport you back to the memory of when that picture was taken. There's a study where people were shown pictures that have nostalgic significance to them while undergoing an fMRI scan, and it was found that there was significant activation in the brain's reward system, as well as regions that deal with autobiographical memory. There was also a high degree of coordination between these two areas of the brain. Similar regions of the brain were shown to be activated in a PET scan study where smells were the nostalgic trigger. It's actually theorized that scent might be one of the most powerful nostalgic triggers because the olfactory bulb, which processes smells, has a direct link to the limbic system, which plays a big role in processing both emotions and memories. Anybody remember the song Stressed Out by 21 Pilots? It's basically a song all about nostalgia, and scents even get a special shout out in the song. Sometimes a certain smell will take me back to when I was young. How come I'm never able to identify where it's coming from? Sorry about that. Speaking of music, it's another powerful nostalgia trigger, especially songs from our adolescence and young adulthood. The idea is that all the extra hormones that we have around this time increase the intensity of the feel-good response that we get when we hear a song we really like. This can create a powerful emotional memory which is regulated, as you might have guessed, by the limbic system. Other brain areas that we haven't discussed yet are also activated by music-triggered nostalgia, including the medial prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. These areas of the brain are part of a network that's involved in emotional regulation and self-reflection. Other nostalgia triggers involve remembering personal events that are meaningful to you or experiencing events that remind you of old times, maybe like a baseball game, especially if you're a little bit older. These triggers activate many of the same brain regions that we've already discussed. Okay, so just to recap, because I know that was a lot, there are different triggers that seem to bring on slightly different nostalgic experiences based on the neural systems and areas that they activate. These include self-reflection related regions, including these areas, autobiographical memory related regions, including these areas, emotional regulation regions, including these areas, and reward related regions, including these areas. All of these regions of the brain put together make up what some researchers are calling the nostalgic brain. Okay, so now we know a little bit more about things that can trigger nostalgia and what's happening in the brain when we get nostalgic, but there's a bigger question that we have to answer. Why do we get nostalgic in the first place? From a psychological and emotional standpoint, what purpose does it serve? We've talked about a number of triggers for nostalgia, but there's an important one that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's a little bit different than the others. Yep. One of the biggest triggers for nostalgia are times when we're feeling bad. Makes sense, right? A lot of times when you're feeling bad about something that's going on right now. So why not escape into a nostalgic memory that you can feel better about? One study that I read characterized this trigger more specifically as a sense of loss caused by unfavorable reality or environment. Remember the comments from the beginning of the video? It's like I said, a lot of these people seem to think that everything has gone to shit now compared to the past, be that in relation to their own life or maybe just the world in general. But the same study that I read talking about this trigger hypothesizes that an unfavorable reality isn't the only factor at play. More specifically, they state that a sense of disconnectedness and a difficulty with forming social bonds also plays a big role. Basically, the idea is that nostalgia is a way to scratch that social itch when direct social bonds aren't available. You might find yourself looking back on a time when you had more meaningful social bonds or you felt like you belonged more. And a final factor that plays into this is attachment style. I won't go over all of the attachment styles here, but this article theorizes that people with an avoidant attachment style are more prone to nostalgia. According to the article, people who have an avoidant attachment style didn't get their emotional needs met as a child, and so they tend to shy away from emotional connection with others as adults. But there's actually two types of avoidant attachment. There's high avoidance, which are people who perceive others as completely emotionally unavailable and don't even want emotional connection with them. And then there's low avoidance. These are people who are avoidant but do see others as potentially emotionally available, and they secretly long for connection with others. These low avoidant people do want connection, but sometimes their avoidant tendencies can make it hard for them to form the social bonds that they're looking for, and so they more often than not resort to nostalgia. So to summarize with a quote from the article, nostalgia is triggered under the following three conditions: deficiencies in belonging caused by an unfavorable environment, a tendency towards low avoidance, and an inability to recognize the reconstruction of social bonds in reality. These are some pretty specific feel-bad conditions, and they make sense to me as triggers in a lot of ways. But even though it seems like these are kind of ideal conditions for nostalgia, it also seems like any kind of bad mood can be a trigger. Anxiety, grief. There's even a 2006 study where people were found to be more nostalgic after reading a negative news article as opposed to a neutral or a positive one. Okay, so given this, it's time to address one of the key questions that I brought up in the beginning of the video. Is nostalgia healthy? To give you a brief answer, it kind of depends. Nostalgia has actually been shown to have a lot of benefits, some of which you might not expect, but under the wrong circumstances, nostalgia can take you down a dark road. Nostalgic depression is basically what it sounds like. It includes symptoms like these that are typical of depression, specifically within the context of nostalgia. A longing for a past experience, coupled with the feeling of despair that comes from knowing that that experience is gone. The mindset that you're in when you experience nostalgia seems to be a big determinant of whether nostalgia is going to have a positive or negative effect on your mental health. If you're somebody who's deeply dissatisfied with your current reality, like the personality profile we talked about in the last section, then nostalgia is probably going to push you further into misery. Several studies that I read support this idea. One study found that people who are already prone to significant anxiety tend to experience even greater levels of depression and anxiety when they engage in nostalgia. Another study found that nostalgia tended to have more negative psychological consequences in people who were from lower income households, the idea being that they were experiencing nostalgia in less favorable situations than people who were in higher income households. One of the things that makes this worse is our tendency to misremember the past as being better than it actually was. A lot of the reading that I've done on nostalgia mentions our tendency to focus on only the positive aspects of the memories that we're nostalgic about and minimize or even totally forget all the negative aspects of them. I do this all the time when I nostalgize, and I know I do it, but sometimes I don't even realize the degree to which I do it until I catch myself. For example, I went to grad school in New York from 2018 to 2020, and I absolutely fucking hated it. Those were some of the worst years of my life. I used to count down the hours until each individual day was over, and count down the days until the program was over. Okay, only a little over 400 days to go. I can do that. It'll be over before I know it. But when I look back on that time, even though I do remember the bad times, just because there were so many of them, the thing that stands out to me the most are the very few good memories that I have. So imagine how fondly I remember the times in my life that were actually good. I don't know if other people do this to the same extent that I do it, but they definitely do it too. An imperfect present, and especially a present that we're highly dissatisfied with, will never be able to compete with an idealized version of the past. And if we don't remember this when we engage in nostalgia, we're setting ourselves up for consistent unhappiness. So at this point, it's looking pretty bad for nostalgia. It kind of seems like we should avoid it at all costs. Time to bring a little balance to the conversation, I think, and get to a topic that I've hinted at several times in this video so far. The good news is that almost every article I read that warned about the potential negative effects of nostalgia also highlighted a lot of positive ones. Most of the research that I read seems to agree that nostalgia can actually be good for your self-image and sense of social connectedness if you're in the right mindset when you experience it. It can remind you of all the people that you've been close to and who have loved you throughout the years, and help you build this consistent narrative of self-worth. And looking back on memories with loved ones who are still in your life is especially helpful in reminding you how important those relationships are and how much they've meant to you over the years. Even looking back on memories of people and things that you've lost can be helpful if you frame it correctly. Think about it this way: if you're looking back on somebody or something that you yearn for and is no longer in your life, you can either think to yourself, oh, poor me, look what I lost, nothing will ever be that good again, guess I'll just rot. Or it can motivate you to do something about how shitty you feel in your current reality. It can inspire you to try to recapture in some kind of way that thing that you feel like you've lost. Nostalgia also has some really unexpected benefits too. Across all the studies that I read, there's evidence that nostalgia can act as an analgesic in the sense that it can literally reduce physical pain, strengthen your immune system, reduce cortisol following acute stress, make you less sensitive to cold temperatures, and even reduce your fear of death. I know that some of this sounds pretty crazy, but if you read the articles, there's actually pretty decent evidence for a lot of these things. If I went into depth explaining the science around each one of these points, it would probably add like another 20 minutes to the video, so I decided to spare your time and your brains. But let me know if you're interested in learning a little bit more, and I might consider making a follow-up video just about this. But also, if you want to read more for yourself, all of the articles are linked in the description. The final benefit to nostalgia that I keep seeing is probably the most broad and philosophical. They say that nostalgia can play a big role in giving you a greater sense of meaning in your life. I think an interesting take on this comes from the article that we read earlier when we talked about the personality profile of people who are most likely to experience nostalgia. If you remember, one of the main conclusions that that article came to was that people are more prone to nostalgia if they don't have a sense of social connectedness or belonging. Near the end of the article, the author links meaning and purpose with belonging. Not just belonging to a social circle, but belonging in our lives and in the world in general. So the author ultimately presents nostalgia as a way to construct a world where we feel like we do belong, or maybe to look back on a time when we feel like we belonged more than we do now. I think this is an interesting idea, and it might be true for some people. But I have another one. If you think about the experiences that you find yourself getting nostalgic about, a lot of times they're happy ones. Sometimes they're even your best memories. I know for me, a lot of the memories that I get nostalgic about are memories that I find to be defining moments in my life now. Sometimes I think about those times sadly and longingly because they're over now. But sometimes I think about those as the moments that made life worth living. Yeah, I know, it's kind of cheesy, but seriously, I can't think of a better way to remind ourselves how meaningful life is than to think of all of our most important and meaningful memories. Around the end of 2023, I went through a pretty big transition in my life. And ultimately it was for the best, but while I was going through it, it was pretty tough. And I don't know if I've ever felt more lost and purposeless. I hated being alone with my thoughts during that time because basically all that I did was nostalgize about the past and how much better it was than the present. That habit started to fade away the more that I started to establish myself in the new life that I was trying to build for myself. I still get nostalgic now, and as I've said before, sometimes I still get sad when I think about the past and the way that things used to be. But now it feels more bittersweet than just bitter. I've been trying to work on remembering my good memories in a more realistic way, and I've been looking forward to making new ones. I don't think there's anything wrong with nostalgia, but if you're somebody who's really prone to it, try to recognize if you're engaging in it in a way that's more helpful or harmful to you. I understand I might sound preachy to some people when I say that. I mean, if 2023 me heard me saying all of this, I would tell me to go fuck myself. Maybe you feel like life does suck right now, or the world sucks right now. But we can't go back to the past, and we can't escape to an ideal version of reality that never existed in the first place. Try to figure out what you actually miss about those memories and see if you can't find a way to recapture that or some version of that in your life today. And maybe you can't right now, but it's at least something to keep in mind and work towards. Being nostalgic can be great, but don't forget to never stop making new memories to be nostalgic about.